Established by the Board of Regents in 2005 with generous contributions by many individuals and organizations, the Dan and Maggie Inouye Distinguished Chair in Democratic Ideals honors the late senator and his wife Maggie's lifetime commitment to democratic ideals and public service by bringing scholars, activists, and artists of the highest caliber to the UH community. Housed in the Department of American Studies and William S. Richardson School of Law, the Inouye chair holders give a public lecture and engage in teaching and other activities while in residence at UH Manoa. Recent shareholders include activist, scholar, and writer Angela Davis, labor activist Ai-jen Poo, film director and producer Chris Eyre, attorney, tribal judge, legal scholar, and activist Walter Echohawk, and most recently, ACLU National Legal Director David Cole. This year, we have been extremely fortunate to have Professor Marcus Rediker, who has been in residence in Hawaii for the entire spring semester. And in addition to teaching an American Studies graduate seminar, How to Write History from Below, he has given numerous, and I emphasize numerous, talks, led conversations, participated in events, and really gone out of his way to learn about Hawaii's complex history, place, culture, and people. He has been tremendously generous in engaging our community and serve as a true model of democratic ideals and public engagement. I am glad that you are all here today to be part of his last public event during his residency. I'd like to thank all the individuals and organizations that have helped make his residency such an enriching experience by organizing, hosting, publicizing, and attending various events. These individuals and organizations include, but are not limited to, Gay Chan of the Department of Art and Art History, Nandita Sharma of the Department of Sociology, Terry Skillman at the Judiciary History Center, Joseph Tanke in the Department of History and the Director of International Cultural Studies Program, Doris Duke Theater, Hawaii J20, King Kamehameha V Judiciary History Center, as well as the members of the Inouye Chair Committee, Dean Peter Arnada, Dean Avi Soifer, Noel Kahanu, Robert Perkinson, Sarah Lynn Smith, and all the very hardworking staff at the UH Foundation. Now I am going to introduce the person who is going to introduce Marcus Rediker. Elizabeth Colwell is an associate professor of American Studies. As an expert on African diaspora, slavery and emancipation, and revolution in the Atlantic world, she is deeply familiar with Marcus's large body of work, and she has also gotten to know Marcus through various events and social occasions this semester. Please welcome my good friend and colleague, Betsy Colwell.
Welcome, everybody. We are so fortunate to have with us today distinguished historian Marcus Rediker. And it is so appropriate that this talk is on May Day, International Workers' Day, because he has spent decades writing about the history of working people, visionaries and insurgents, people like the fearless Benjamin Lay, the extraordinary Quaker dwarf and revolutionary abolitionist who was the biographical subject of his latest book. Professor Rediker is a consummate storyteller, but it's one thing to say that and another thing to hear it, and you will hear it soon enough. His stories are unusual in that they reach out and grab us, they engage us immediately, but they've also changed the way that we think about the past. He inherited that art of storytelling, he tells us, from his grandfather, who told him many tales of life in the mines and factories of Kentucky and Tennessee. He tells us that he wasn't born into a household of books, but nonetheless, he did inherit all of these rich histories that were passed down by word of mouth. He was born landlocked, but he has spent his whole life then studying ocean currents and following them in various ways, usually turbulent ones, it strikes me, because he's always connecting the human experience with broader global patterns of exploitation and with collective movements for social change. he really loves his historical subjects, and he makes us love them too. One example of that is pirates. That's a case in point. Way before Johnny Depp and Pirates of the Caribbean, he was doing original research in archives all over the Atlantic world, exploring the social history of real pirates. And he finds much to admire in those alleged villains, masterless men and the occasional cross-dressed woman. And he sees that they work to create a more egalitarian maritime culture. The titles of his books, such as Villains of All Nations, Outlaws of the Atlantic, Between the Devil and the Deep Blue Sea. Yeah, we should all ask him for titles. These books focus on a motley crew of working people in the long 18th century who rebel against the harsh conditions of their lives. Professor Rediker's work has been informed by the social movements of the 60s and the 70s. And the research that he's done and the books that he's published have had a profound impact on a whole series of fields. For example, at a time when labor historians on the continent were primarily dealing with land-based white working men, his work represented a real paradigm shift. And he also charted a new course in maritime history and the history of the Atlantic world. The sea, in his vision of Atlantic maritime history, is not an empty space that one crosses in order to get to land. The sea is alive, it's a living force, and the ship itself is a space that spawns new cultures and collectivities. His Atlantic world is not just a world of elites. His prize-winning book with Peter Linebaugh, for example, The Many-Headed Hydra, uncovered this multinational, multi-ethnic, multiracial world of slaves and indentured servants and soldiers and sailors who together sometimes protested enclosures and the harshness of their lives and colonialism. Professor Rediker is also a longtime activist around issues of peace and social justice, and especially an activist against the death penalty. His conversations with men in prison, some of them on death row, led him to see the seeds of the modern carceral system in the history of the slave ship. And he wrote a book by that name, The Slave Ship, subtitled A Human History. No wonder that his work has touched so many lives and won so many accolades. He is Distinguished Professor of Atlantic History at the University of Pittsburgh. He's authored or edited 10 books. His work has been translated into 15 languages. He's won prizes and awards in all kinds of diverse fields, from social and labor history to racial justice to documentary filmmaking. Indeed, one of his prizes has been for an extraordinary documentary film called Ghosts of the Amistad, on which he followed the lives of men who had mutinied in the 19th century, who were enslaved and mutinied at sea. And he followed their traces all the way back to Sierra Leone to find their home villages and their descendants. So, somehow, amidst all of this, he still seems to have time for other lives. His most important second life, from what I hear, is basketball, college basketball. But in addition to that, he has wonderfully eclectic taste in art. It's lead kapana in music, and in art, it's Caravaggio on the one hand and Haitian painting on the other hand. And now he's writing a book about Moby Dick. So I just want to end with just a couple of words about how his collective spirit really infuses the work that he's done here. As Mari mentioned, he has given, I think, 7 different talks while he has been here to different audiences. He has taught a class on history from below. He's really become a part of the community. And in fact, the week after he arrived in Honolulu, he joined the MLK March and joined the hotel workers on that march. So in other words, the point is that he pitches in. And in that sense, I think one could say that in some respects, he's very much like some of the characters who people the pages of his books. He's not a pirate. But nonetheless, he is, I think he has, well, I guess first of all, he shares a belief in his fellow creatures, to use an 18th century phrase. And he also he really has a commitment to an egalitarian spirit. And in addition to that, he has a real faith in the possibilities of radical change on this earth. So he will be speaking today about the democratic powers of history from below. It is a real honor to introduce the Dan and Maggie Inouye Distinguished Chair in Democratic Ideals, Dr. Marcus Rediker.
Okay, Betsy, thank you. I sort of think she should just give the rest of the talk. I don't know about you, but I also want to thank the members of the Inouye Committee. Robert Perkinson was the first person who invited me to come to Honolulu. I think Mari Yoshihara has been a paragon of a colleague in helping me to meet people and to speak to people. Peter Arnada, your dean. I'd also like to thank Noel. Noel has been very welcoming. Ken Inouye, Avi Soifer. Every one of these people did something personal and kind to welcome me here, and I appreciated that very much. Mari, do you and Robert see now the problem of waiting until the end for me to give this talk? Because I'm going to have to stand up here for 30 minutes and thank everybody, because that's the way Southerners are. You know, we have to do that. But there is one group I want to acknowledge in particular, and these are the people who have been in my class, How to Write History from Below, students and faculty members. So could I ask those people to stand up? Now, I just want to say I have a specific reason for wanting you to acknowledge them, because over the course of this lecture, I'm going to shamelessly steal the smart things they said in class. And so this way they can't say that they didn't get any acknowledgement, because they did. Okay, so here we are on May Day. Happy May Day, everyone. Happy May Day. Happy Lay Day. This is the International Workers' Holiday, and I'm sure almost all of you know that, in fact, this is a specifically American holiday. It grew up in Chicago in the 1880s during the struggle for the 8-hour day. Everybody today takes for granted that we work 8 hours a day, but of course I think more people are working longer than 8 hours a day now. But then this holiday went around the world and became extremely famous, became the workers' holiday. This is a holiday from below. And watching this international working class movement grow, President Grover Cleveland says in 1894, we had better have Labor Day instead. So it's a shame that the United States does not fully recognize this great day, but I do think it's more than appropriate to be holding this talk on May Day, because this really is, as I've said, from below. So History from Below has been the theme of my visit. I taught that course. I gave a talk on art history from below at Gay's invitation. I did 2 talks with Nandita about migrants. That is history from below. I gave a talk in American Studies about the books that have shaped my life. That was about how history from below came to be my major concern. We had Peter Linebaugh here 2 weeks ago. How many of you saw him? Okay, quite a few. The rest of you who didn't, I'm kind of glad because he's a hard act to follow. Many of you will know what I mean by that. But anyway, here we are, the democratic power of history from below. And I want to tell you that I have worked hard to prepare this lecture. I have been working on this lecture for 46 years. 1973 was when I first discovered that history from below is something I should do, something I should study. And so what I want to do this evening is really address three topics. What is history from below? What are its origins? What are its varieties? That's the first topic. The second, I want to give some examples of history from below in action. I want to use those stories to illustrate the major themes of history from below. That's the second part. And the third part, I want to ask in the end, why does history from below matter? And I want to relate it specifically to democratic ideals. So I'm taking the title of the Inouye chair very seriously. Okay, so to begin, let me give you a context for understanding history from below. Folks, there is a war going on, and it's a war over history. It's a war over what our history is and how we should tell it. Now, I want to focus on one specific battle in this war. Many of you will remember that in 1992, George H.W. Bush decided to create the National Council of Education Standards and to pose the question, what should we be teaching to young people about American history and world history? The National Endowment for the Humanities got involved in this. The Organization of American Historians got involved in this. There is a National History Standards Project based at UCLA, which was led by a good friend of mine, Gary Nash, very distinguished early American historian. They came up with the best scholarship of the previous generation. All of the new findings that historians in a really creative moment had come up with about race and slavery, about class relationships, about gender and the history of women. And they incorporated all of this really exciting new scholarship into these new history standards. This, folks, is something that I think almost all historians would agree we need to teach. And then this proposal was submitted to the United States Senate, and the Senate voted 99-1 against. And actually the one senator who voted for it, I think he was confused. I think he later said that he wasn't in favor of the standard, so I think it was pretty much unanimous. But listen to what was said about why these new standards were unacceptable. First of all, they presented a picture of American history that was, quote, too grim and gloomy, end quote. But even more revealingly, it was said that these new standards were, quote, insufficiently patriotic, end quote. Now notice that truth has nothing to do with it. But what the senators were saying, basically, is that a history that tells the truth about America's real past is not acceptable, thereby revealing, in my view, what the main purpose of history education is and has been for a very long time, and that is to make young men and women willing to fight in foreign wars. So we have, in this country especially, a lot of denial about our history. We put a lot of energy in pretending that we don't have the actual history we do. And here's something that's very important. We have very great histories of race, class, and gender oppression in this country. And in many cases, the U.S. government was actively complicit in that oppression. So it's not at all surprising that some people don't want that history to be told. So, my first point is that history from below is part of a continuing battle of ideas. And it goes on to this day, right now, all across the country, in local school boards. People are debating what is our real history and how should we teach it. Okay, so let's talk for a minute about what history from below actually is. The best place to start is with a phrase that I suspect everybody in the room has heard, and that is, history is written by the winners. Folks, that's true. History was written for the longest time by those people who came out on top of the historical processes. The most privileged, the wealthiest, those are the people who, for a very long time, wrote the histories. History was, for a long time, a gentleman's parlor activity. That began to change in the early 20th century, and then it really began to change after World War II with the democratization of American higher education. Whereas more and different kinds of people began to be educated and then began to become professors themselves, and they wanted to tell different stories about the past. So the old history from above, let's start there. The old history from above, the one that I think many of us were raised with, is really all about great men. And let me give you one example of the way history is presented in that idiom. I guarantee you this is something that you all will have heard. President Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. Now, it is true that Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. But how enslaved people came to be emancipated is a very complex question, and there are a lot more actors in that story than Abraham Lincoln. Let me just give you two quick examples. Historians now see that this rupture called the Civil War was provoked in a very big way by enslaved Africans who continually ran away to seek their freedom, leaving the plantations behind, basically putting their lives at risk as they did so. Thousands upon thousands of people did it. This ended up resulting in the creation of fugitive slave laws, a big struggle over whether people who had escaped to the north would be returned to the south, and this was a major reason why there was eventually a breaking point that led to civil war. Now, once the Civil War broke out, something else happened. As the great scholar W.E.B. Du Bois said many years ago, as soon as the fighting started, all across the plantation South, enslaved people stopped working. Du Bois called it a general strike. They continued to produce food for themselves, their families, and frequently even for the masters. But they decided just to let's see what's going to happen. But as it turns out, that decision to strike had a huge impact on the Confederate Army. It's now very hard to feed the Confederate Army. That then fueled desertion from the Confederate Army. So you see here, two really extraordinary actions taken by enslaved people had a big impact on the coming of the Civil War and eventually on the coming of freedom. History from above hides all that. It distorts, it oversimplifies, it falsifies. Now, as it turns out, History from Below has its own anthem. And this was written in 1935 by the German playwright and poet Bertolt Brecht. A worker reads history. Folks, this sums it up so beautifully. Who built the 7 gates of Thebes? The books are filled with the names of kings. But was it kings who hauled the craggy blocks of stone? And Babylon, so many times destroyed, who built the city up each time? In which of Lima's houses, that city glittering with gold, lived those who built it? In the evening when the Chinese wall was finished, where did the masons go? Imperial Rome is full of arcs of triumph. Who reared them up? Over whom did the Caesars triumph? Byzantium lives in song, were all her dwellings palaces. And even in Atlantis of the legend, the night the sea rushed in, the drowning men still bellowed for their slaves. Young Alexander conquered India. He alone? Caesar beat the Gauls. Was there not even a cook in his army? Philip of Spain wept as his fleet was sunk and destroyed. Were there no other tears? Frederick the Great triumphed in the 7 Years' War. Who triumphed with him? Each page of victory, at whose expense the victory ball. Every 10 years a great man, who paid the piper? So many particulars, so many questions. So there you have it. You look at history from below and you see a different process. You see the builders of the world, not the people who lived off of their labor. You see the people who conquered the world, but who helped them. It asks very simple questions. Who are these people who built civilization as we know it? Well, history from below actually goes under many names. It's broader than labor history. It's more precise than the history of the masses. Some people call it radical history. Others call it people's history. People's history is sometimes a nationalist story, so I don't like that one so much. But I think history from below is best because that very phrase implies a verb. History as seen from below. History as made from below. And it also implies a relationship to those above. Because even though history from below may be a rhetorical declaration of sympathy with the poor and the oppressed, it is always about power. It is always about those above who wield power, because without those above, there wouldn't be any down below. So history from below is about real people in real situations. One of the goals is always to humanize the subjects of history, to democratize the subjects of history, and then finally, to find the poetry in history from below, the poetry of people's struggles, what they were trying to achieve, what kind of better worlds could they dream. So where did it come from, this history from below? Well, the first usage of the phrase history from below, actually I learned this from Peter Linebaugh 2 weeks ago, was by a French historian named Lucien Febvre. He was one of the founders of one of the great historical journals called Annales. But it was kind of in the air in the 1930s. Brecht is writing in 1935. So this is an origin among the movements of the 1930s. But the really crucial decade for the origins of history from below is 1965 to 1975 in the social movements that Betsy alluded to. First and foremost, I would emphasize the civil rights movement. Most people don't know it, but one of the things that the NAACP did early in the civil rights struggle was to create a department to study how African American people had been treated in history textbooks. Black Power, another very important movement, which demanded a new reckoning with race and slavery in America's history. The anti-war movement, the war in Vietnam, occupied the energies of an entire generation, and those people wanted a new history of American imperialism. And of course, there is what may be the greatest challenge of them all, posed by the women's movement, who said nothing less than, give us a history which has the majority of humanity in it. We demand that history. All of these groups were demanding a new kind of history. So what we see is that history from below is an insurgent history. It is part of a challenge for power, trying to tell a different story that takes seriously people's struggles. The impulse is originally political and then only secondarily professional. Crucial groups in the growth of history from below were, for example, the Communist Party Historians Group of Great Britain, which featured this character, E.P. Thompson, who wrote in 1963 what is regarded, I think, as probably the greatest history from below ever written, a book called The Making of the English Working Class. I made my students read all 832 pages of it. At least I hope they, I don't know, I'm not sure. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was another major source of history from below. The Mississippi Freedom Summer School came up with an entire curriculum for how to teach people the history of the civil rights struggle. Students for a Democratic Society was another major source. In fact, history from the bottom up, that idea championed by a historian named Jesse Leamish, came out of an early SDS pamphlet. There were other women's organizations. Everybody wants something new. Now, I want to emphasize, I'm talking mostly about the US, but this is a worldwide movement in the 60s and 70s. Thompson comes from the UK, Leamish from the US. From the Caribbean, there's C.L.R. James, whom we also read in our course. Natalie Zeman Davis and Sylvia Federici gave us women's history from below. In Latin America, the great Uruguayan writer Eduardo Galeano did a brilliant history from below in a trilogy called Memory of Fire, written in a magical realist mode. And of course, this doesn't begin to exhaust the opportunities, the existence of history from below. Brazil, South Africa, India, and of course, folks, there's important work going on right now in Hawaii. And this is especially important. Peter Arnata tells me that there are massive archives yet to be studied in the Hawaiian language, and we can only hope that we will see major advances in this kind of history from below. So there are different kinds of history from below. There's African American history from below, gender history, labor history. There is intellectual history from below. There is microhistory. There is indigenous history from below. There is transnational history from below. So what I want to do for the remainder of my time here is to talk about 4 incidents, 4 events. Each one of them will indicate a different major theme in history from below. 4 stories. The first one, folks, we're going to go straight to the heart of darkness. The heart of darkness of global capitalism. We're going to the slave trade. One of the greatest crimes against humanity ever to be committed. The year is 1727. We're on a slave ship in the middle of the Atlantic. The ship is known as the Loyal George, captained by a man named Timothy Tucker. There is a West African man on this ship. He is nameless to us, as are so many millions in this slave trade. He is nameless to us. He has been sick on the voyage, and he has decided that he is going to die. But Captain Tucker is determined that he will not die because he wants to be able to sell this man to a plantation owner on the other side of the Atlantic. So he tries to force feed this man to keep him alive. The man spits the food back in the captain's face. The captain then calls for his horsewhip. And he shakes the whip in front of the man's face. And the man replies with one word. He says, Adoma. That means, so be it. The captain ties him to the mainstays and flogs him mercilessly. A sailor who tells this story says that the man was a bloody mess from his neck to his ankles after this flogging, and the captain decides it's time to eat his dinner, which he sits down on the deck and does. Now this, folks, is with all 200 of the other enslaved people watching, because punishments were always exemplary, meant to terrify everybody. So the captain tries to get the man to take more food. The man refuses again. The captain pulls out a pistol. The man looks at him and he says, Adoma, so be it. The captain shoots the man at point blank range. The bullet goes into his head. The blood gushes. The man grabs his head in this manner, but he keeps looking the captain right in the eye, and he does not fall. The captain pulls another pistol and shoots him in the head again, and again he will not go down. Finally, the captain shoots him a 3rd time, killing him. But by this time, an insurrection has broken out on the ship, in which the other enslaved Africans are so infuriated by his treatment and so inspired by his resistance that they rise up in a desperate struggle to capture the ship. They don't succeed. Rarely does anyone succeed in capturing a slave ship. But I want you to notice what's happened here. An individual moment of resistance has become a collective response. This happened frequently. This is an important part of history from below. And as I said, this was recounted, this story, in a memoir by a man named Silas Told. He became a Methodist minister. Methodists were opposed to slavery in this time. I wonder where else this story was told. On plantations, on the waterfront, on the decks of ships, in how many different African languages, in how many different European languages. The story of the man who said Adoma and refused to die. Folks, the slave ship is probably the most challenging place to try to study history from below. Because it was said of the slave ship that there is no place on earth in which so much human misery is concentrated into so small a space. And this is what I try to do to understand that reality in this book that Betsy mentioned, The Slave Ship, A Human History. Living with that kind of mortal horror in the story I've just described. But folks, there was a saving grace. And the saving grace is exemplified by that nameless man. Because no matter what the horrors that happened on a slave ship, people fought back in any way they could, by refusing to eat, by jumping over the side, by waging insurrections. They asserted their humanity under these extreme circumstances. I think of Adoma as a one-word poem of resistance. Adoma. And this reminds me of something Anne Lauterbach, a poet herself, once wrote. Poetry is the aversion to the assertion of power. Poetry is that which resists dominance. So here's the main point of this story. Absolutely central to History from Below is oppression and resistance to oppression, locked in this kind of struggle of the kind you see on this ship. This is central. This is central to History from Below. That's point number one. Our second story is also one that happened at sea. It's around the same time. It's in the year 1720. We're in the Caribbean now. It's a foggy morning, and a group of pirates on board a ship called the Ranger have just discovered, coming out of the fog, a British warship that is coming to capture them. 3 of the pirates on the main deck are desperately working to fire the cannon to hit that approaching vessel and try to drive it off. But most of the pirates are drunk. This is not an uncommon thing on pirate ships. So they all go down into the hold to hide, as if you can hide from a warship that's coming to capture you. And this included, by the way, a man named Calico Jack Rackham. Isn't that like a really great name? Calico Jack. He wore calico pants. This, I think, is the basis of Jack Sparrow and Pirates of the Caribbean, but don't get me started on that. So anyway, these pirates are captured. They're taken into Port Royal, Jamaica. They're taken to court. It's a huge court scene. They are charged with piracy. It's a very quick trial. And the judge looks at this group of pirates and says, "You are all to be taken to the edge of the water where you will be hanged by the neck until you are dead, dead, dead. And may the Lord have mercy on your souls." And at this point, 2 of the pirates stand up. And they say, "My Lord, we plead our bellies." The judge is stumped. "You plead your bellies?" "Yes, my Lord, we're pregnant." The judge stops the proceedings and has someone look into the matter, and it turns out these 2 are women, and they are indeed pregnant, and they knew that it was against British law to execute pregnant women. So here I'm happy to introduce you. Well, first of all, we'll get a hanging scene here. Yeah, this is what was supposed to happen and will eventually happen. And here are your heroines. They didn't really look quite like that. But Anne Bonny and Mary Read were, in fact, 2 real pirates. They were women warriors, really, women warriors. Now, the context for these women doing this remarkable thing that they did, dressing as men and going to sea, is that in the golden age of piracy, and again, Betsy mentioned this, you have a period in the 17 teens and 1720s where pirates under the black flag, this is the period when the black flag with the skull and the crossbones is invented. A crisis in world trade has been created by these 5,000 or so pirates. So I decided to study this. I studied it in a book called Villains of All Nations, and I had a very simple question. These pirates, these people who became pirates, what did they think they were doing? Why did they become pirates? Well, it turns out they were all common sailors on naval and merchant ships where their lives were absolute hell. Low pay, poor quality food like biscuit that's got so many roaches it'll locomote itself around all over the deck. Floggings, like what we saw on the slave ship. Very similar situation for sailors. The use of the cat o' nine tails. You want to think of an 18th century ship captain? Think Captain Ahab, but more violent. So against all this, pirates decided to organize their own ships in a completely different way. The first thing they did was they elected their officers. Folks, this is unthinkable. Poor people had no right to vote for anything in this period. Least of all something that would affect their own lives like this. They institute shipboard democracy. They also divide up their plunder in shockingly equal ways. They feast all the time. They put away the lash. Nobody will ever be whipped on a pirate ship unless every member of the ship believes that's an appropriate punishment. The arbitrary power of the captain is removed. So what these pirates are doing as they attack the vessels of the merchant shipping industry, they're providing a subversive example of a completely different way of running a ship. So that's one of the reasons why the imperial authorities have to track them down and execute them. And they execute them by the hundreds. This is a very common scene in any port city in the 17 teens and 1720s. So my point here is that Anne Bonny and Mary Read radicalized pirate democracy even further by showing that freedom under the Jolly Roger wasn't only for men. And they were kind of famous in their own day. They inspired art, they inspired theater, they inspired music. They were well known, but then they were forgotten. So we'll go back to the moment when actually the execution of several of these pirates is taking place, including Calico Jack Rackham. They're standing on a platform that's going to collapse underneath them. They have the noose around their neck. And Anne Bonny and Mary Read are standing nearby, along with hundreds and hundreds of people who come to see this. And Calico Jack Rackham looks imploringly at Anne Bonny, who was his lover. He wants like an expression of sympathy, and he looks at her. And Anne says in a loud voice, so that everybody can hear, "Jack, don't look at me like that. Because if you had fought like a man, you wouldn't be hanged like a dog right now." And the crowd bursts into laughter. So gallows humor is also part of History from Below. But there's an even bigger point. Notice, History from Below is about action people take to free themselves from oppressive circumstances. It's how they organize themselves. It's how they emancipate themselves. And sometimes you can see how they glimpse an alternative society, something more humane than what they knew in their workaday lives. Okay, so that's Anne Bonny and Mary Read. Now the year is 1738, and we are in a very different place. We're on land at last. We're in Burlington, New Jersey, for a big meeting of Quakers. This is the annual meeting, the Philadelphia Quaker yearly meeting. Hundreds upon hundreds of Quakers have come. I'm sure you all know Pennsylvania at this time is the Quaker colony. King Charles II owed the Penn family a lot of money, so rather than pay them money, which he didn't have, he says, just take all this land over there in North America, not bothering to think that it actually belonged to Native Americans. But this is the origins of Pennsylvania. The story about Quakers is that they came to do good, and in fact, they did well. They got rich on trade, on land, and they did what all the other rich people in that time did. They bought slaves. So slavery is a part of the Quaker experiment, especially among what are called the weighty Quakers, the big Quakers, the rich Quakers, the very ones who are running the meeting in Burlington, New Jersey in 1738, wherein steps this man, Benjamin Lay. He's 4 feet tall. He has dwarfism. He also has kyphosis, the curvature of the thoracic vertebrae. He's walked 20 miles on foot to be at the meeting in Burlington, New Jersey. And folks, he is in a fury that Quakers own slaves. He is a very devout Quaker himself, and he's come to this meeting to deliver a prophecy. He considers himself an Old Testament prophet. Okay? So here's what he's done. He's put on a military uniform. Now, this is already weird because Quakers are pacifists, right? They've accepted the peace testimony in 1660, and they've forsaken war and weapons of all times. But he's got of all kinds. But he's got on a military uniform, and moreover, strapped to his waist, he's got a belt with a sword. Then he's taken a book, and he's carved out a secret compartment, and he's taken an animal bladder and filled it up with bright red pokeberry juice, and he's tied that off, and he puts that inside the book. And then he takes an overcoat and throws it over the uniform and the sword and the book so nobody can see what he's doing. And then he goes and sits in the middle of all of these wealthy Quaker slave owners. Now, Quakers, it's a very egalitarian religion. They don't have a formal minister. They speak as the Spirit moves them. So Benjamin Lay stands up at a certain point in the Quaker meeting, and in a very loud, booming voice, he's a small man, but he had quite a voice, he says, "Slave keeping is the greatest sin in the world." Then he throws off the overcoat, and a gasp, a loud, audible gasp, fills the room. Then he takes the book, and he holds it above his head, and he pulls out the sword. And he says, "God will take vengeance against those who oppress their fellow creatures." And he runs the sword through the book, and the blood comes gushing down his arm, and then he sprinkles it on the heads and bodies of the slave owners. And if you think you're surprised, how do you think they felt? This was the blood of vengeance. Now, of course, the place burst into total pandemonium, and Benjamin just stands there as still as a statue. Just the blood is trickling. He's just standing there. And then several of the Quakers run and they grab him up. It's not that hard to pick him up. And they take him and they throw him out into the street on a rainy day, and they slam the door shut, and they hope they're done with him. But he's not done with them. So he comes back, and right at the step of the door, where everybody's going to have to leave as they come out, he lies down in the mud so that everyone will have to step over his body as they leave. No business as usual, says Benjamin Lay. Now, folks, this is an extraordinary man, but he was an ordinary working man. He had been a shepherd and a sailor, and one of the great mysteries in writing this book, The Fearless Benjamin Lay, is how a man with no real education managed to arrive 2 generations before the anti-slavery movement emerges at this position that slavery's got to be abolished right now, today. Not gradually, right now. And lest you think Benjamin Lay is only interested in the issue of slavery, let me tell you that he lived in a cave. He made his own clothes. He prepared all of his own food. He grew crops. He was a vegetarian. He believed in animal rights. Folks, this is in the 1730s. He's a remarkable figure. But thanks to him, the Quakers became the first group to outlaw slavery in their own midst. They also will play a leading role in the abolitionist movement when it emerges years after Benjamin Lay has died. But here's the point. Despite his importance, Benjamin Lay has been left out of almost all of the history books. He's too wild. He's too radical. He's from the wrong class, because the story historians tell about abolition is that it's enlightened gentlemen who lead that movement. That's not Benjamin Lay. He's got the wrong body type. Leading historian of abolition called him, quote, a demented little hunchback, end quote. But here's the point we make about history from below. It's all about recovering the lives and thoughts and ideas and voices of people who have been erased from history. And in some cases, like Benjamin Lay, he's a very important figure for the growth of an abolition movement. Okay, our fourth and final incident is 1747, and we're on the waterfront of Boston. This is a story from the Many-Headed Hydra. 3,000 angry workers have dragged a good-sized boat from a man-of-war up on shore, and they are setting it on fire in a defiant destruction of government property. It's men and women, it's an urban mob. They are furious. They are in a rage. Who are they? They are described as seamen, servants, Negroes, and other persons of mean and vile condition. Can't you just hear the sneer in that? They are English. They are Irish. They are Dutch, they are African, they are the motley crew, and they are fighting in self-defense against a press gang. That man-of-war had sent a press gang to capture sailors and take them out to sea. Forced labor, conscripted labor, and they are determined they're not going to go. So what do? They engage in street fighting. They capture naval officers. They beat up the local sheriff. They intimidate the governor, who runs inside the local fortress to kind of stay there and hide until the whole thing blows over. They burn boats because in their minds, impressment is slavery. That's the way they describe it. They are fighting slavery, and they win. The man-of-war has to sail off. But folks, they win at an even higher level, because as this thing is going on, as this battle in the streets is going on, a man named Samuel Adams, yes, that Sam Adams, the one who's on your bottle of beer, but also the founding father who signs the Declaration of Independence, he is watching all this, and he's translating what the sailors are doing in the streets into political discourse. It's a spirit of rebellion. And he says this crowd embodies the natural rights of human beings fighting for liberty. Now, there is a literal truth to this, because when sailors were on shore, that's called being on liberty. So they're fighting for liberty while on liberty. But Sam Adams is saying, folks, this is a philosophical idea. And then he writes, I'm going to quote this now, I found this astonishing when I did the research. Sam Adams writes in 1747 now, he writes, "All men are by nature on a level, born with an equal share of freedom and endowed with capacities nearly alike." Now, does that remind you of anything? Doesn't that sound remarkably like all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights? Folks, that is the origin of that idea. It springs not from the head of a philosopher, but from a motley mob of angry people fighting in the streets. Sam Adams, that's a press gang over there, Sam Adams was educated by those workers in the street. He was taught by them that this was the principle worth fighting for, and this, folks, will become enshrined in the Declaration of Independence. So point number 4 is history from below is all about agency, about the capacity of working people to change the course of history, and in this case, to make innovations in the history of democracy and equality. You see where we're going with this, right? Okay, so to conclude, why does history from below matter? And what is its connection to democratic ideals? Now, I want to ask a simple question. Do we, all of us right here in Honolulu in 2019, do we believe that all people are created equal? Do we believe that? Do we act on that belief? Well, the man who wrote the words, the Declaration of Independence, Tom Jefferson, folks, he didn't believe it at all. He was personally depriving 187 men, women, and children of life, liberty, and happiness as he wrote those words. If you study Notes on the State of Virginia, published, he wrote it about 4 years after he wrote the Declaration, 4 or 5 years, you will find a text absolutely overflowing with racist ideas. So why did he say that in 1776? Why did he say all people are created equal? And why did he not say the thing that was always said in British political theory, life, liberty, and property? Why did he say just that once, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? Well, there are 2 reasons why I think he said those things, and they're both political. The first is that Thomas Jefferson knew that the cause of American independence would require lots of poor people joining militias and the Army and the Navy to make freedom real. And a lot of those people didn't have any property. So you can't say this is about property, because then it's not for them, because they don't have property to protect. But there's something even bigger going on with Jefferson, which is this. Revolutionaries have a desire to frame their goals in universalistic claims. We're not just fighting because we don't want to pay taxes to Great Britain. We're fighting for human freedom at the greatest and highest level. Right? That's what Jefferson was doing. He was writing a document for posterity. History from below would try to understand the people that Jefferson wanted to appeal to, why they decided to join the militias and the Army and the Navy. And it would also, at the same time, challenge Jefferson and those who claim to believe what Jefferson wrote to live up to their own founding ideals. Folks, one of the greatest people ever to do this was Dr. Martin Luther King. He was the conscience of the nation. And the most powerful things he ever said to America were, you say you believe in equality, do you really believe in it? You say you believe in democracy, do you really believe in it? Do you dare to live up to the ideals that you claim are part of your founding project? But see, if we're going to ask those questions, we have to know the real history from below. We have to know why Sam Adams, for example, that once did not say they're fighting for the rights of Englishmen in the streets. You know why he couldn't say that? Because they weren't all English. They were Irish and Dutch and African. So he had to use a universal subject of natural rights of humankind, because the motley crew forced him into a different sort of analysis. We need the real history. So my hope for you, for all of us, is that you will teach history from below. If we believe that all people are created equal, our histories should reflect that fact. History from below is the best way to do it. It is the most democratic form that history can take. It is egalitarian. It is inclusive. It sees everyone. Everyone counts in history from below. And it also helps you to understand how real change happens by way of social movements. So these 4 points, oppression and resistance, self-organization and self-emancipation, voices, agency, the power to make history. These are things that I think we should try to use in our own lives. And so I hope you will teach history from below, but I also hope that you will make history from below, May Day style, because if you don't like the history we've got so far, get out there and make some you do like, because the future is up to us. Thank you very much.
Professor, thanks for speaking to us this evening. My question is in regards to revisionist history, and how would you address people who say teaching history from below is just revisionist history? We're bringing in too much history, and folks who we're letting in, for example, conspiracy theorists and whatnot. How do we filter out, when we teach history from below or make history from below, how do we filter out those revisionist tendencies that are detrimental to getting to what actually happened, if successful?
Yeah, it's a good question. I guess my first point is that all history is revisionist history, because historians are always revising what the previous generation said, not because the facts have changed, but because we ask different questions about the facts. So history is always fluid, always in motion, always changing, and each generation will have new questions. But there is really nothing to be done exactly about crackpot histories, and there are a lot of them right now. A lot of really ridiculous things, but I think. The truth is, these movements that I've mentioned, to the extent that we have a more democratic history now than we had during the Cold War, it's really all because of these movements. And I just want to tell you folks that the work that has been done, for example, on the issue of slavery since the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement in the early 60s is one of the most extraordinary bodies of scholarship ever created. And here's the dilemma. We have this very deep knowledge of the way slave systems work, but there is a tremendous gap between what scholars know and what the general public knows. Now, in some cases, the general public doesn't want to know. And I did get a fair amount of hate mail in writing The Slave Ship, but I expected it. I expected it because when a subject has been surrounded by repression and you write about it, people are going to protest. But I think we just have to join the debate and produce the best scholarship and produce the most lucid, convincing accounts of what actually happened and why that matters to us. I think that's the key thing. Is this history useful to us? How does it help us in the present? Because it's not that we want to be on the side of Benjamin Lay. We want Benjamin Lay to be on our side, right? We want these powerful people who had vision to be with us, to enrich us, to help us think. That's the way I think about it.
Thank you, Marcus. That was amazing. Right on.
Thank you.
Everything was great. My question is very simple. It's about thinking about what's below the below. How do you think about the earth and the ground and the dirt and the ocean and the water and incorporate that below into your history from below?
Yeah, that's a really urgent question, as we all know. There are more and more environmental histories from below. I think Native American history in particular has played a major role in this. So I think one thing we need to do is to think, as Benjamin Lay would have done, about all living things, right? His idea was that all living things have within them divinity. This is not so different, really, from what a lot of Native peoples think, that there is a spark of divinity everywhere. And that then means that we must treat all animals in the way that we would treat other human beings. And this is what Lay would ask. Quakers say, we live by the golden rule, right? Do unto others what you would have them do unto you. Treat the earth the same way. So I think this is a really interesting challenge right now. Because on the one hand, we want a human-centered history, but on the other hand, we have to recognize that human beings are not the only occupants of the earth. And that in fact, an anthropocentric point of view does often make it possible to dominate nature and to help create the catastrophe that we're in. So I think if this is an especially important theme for younger scholars who have been more shaped by the environmental movement. And so I think one of the big questions is, how is that movement demanding a new kind of history? And what kinds of ideas would be most useful to a movement today? We'll see.
Thanks very much, Marcus. Just as good a talk as I first heard you give in a little town in Germany at a maritime history conference 19 years ago. It's been echoing in my mind, and now it'll continue to echo. Here's a question that I've struggled with and tried to deal with in my own research too, and that is, how do we deal with the silences in the records, the written records about people from below? We can get glimpses of them. We can get lots of other voices talking about them. In my first book, I looked at sailors who were being talked about for the most part. And what would you suggest as an approach to kind of bringing them to life and finding ways to hear their voices, even when they aren't necessarily explicit?
Right. No, thank you, Dave. I should have said, I think my friend Dave Chappell should answer that question if I had known it was you. But this is really one of the biggest challenges of history from below, the issue of sources. Because as you know, the poor people don't usually leave documents of their own. I'll give you one example. More than 1 million people were exported from the West African port of Ouidah, and we have first-person accounts by 2 of them. So the systematic destruction of memory, of knowledge systems is frequently part of the oppression that we're dealing with. So I don't think there's any one single answer to your question, Dave. I think we have to try every conceivable method. For example, for sailors, whom we've both studied, one of the ways you can study them is by looking at their songs. Because some people will write down the lyrics of these songs, and they're constantly being improvised and changed. And the other thing that I think is very important is that the more deeply you know any particular subject, the more you can infer through the missing spaces of evidence. The more you can create a kind of logic of process that will allow you to create a plausible explanation that fits with everything else that is known of what others are saying. But the search for the voices is really always tough. For me, it was very important. You know, when I went off to do my dissertation, I had all these wise heads at the University of Pennsylvania saying, you want to study sailors, you'll never find any evidence about them. And so I found 2,200 court cases in which sailors gave testimony. Well, there I had it. But so yeah, I guess in the end, seek and ye shall find. I do believe that.
Well, final question.
I happen to be of an age such that my formative history education ended in 1964, which was the year before you suggest that history from below was born. And so I guess my question is this. I mean, was it born out of Zeus's head, or were there antecedents? And I ask that because as my education was coming to a head in advanced placement, United States history and European history, we were exposed to the great historians of the time, most notably Richard Hofstadter, and what emerged from the process was a realization that the history of the United States is the history of violence and power struggle and bigotry and exploitation and brutality and class struggle and hypocrisy. And what became clear to one, if one thought about it, was that if the world was going to change, you'd better do it yourself, because you couldn't really rely on others. Does any of what I'm describing, in your view, constitute part of the foundation out of which the history from below grew?
It definitely did. And so I should have made clearer, there are many antecedents to history from below. There are many individual practitioners. There are people who are doing work like Du Bois, writing his famous histories in the 30s. These are very important works. But it takes a movement to make this become something bigger. It takes, the movement helps create the breakthrough so that what was a matter of individual practice becomes something that a large number of people now want to work on. But they are definitely working on that set of conclusions that you were drawing about violence and all the rest. Those are part of the elements that people now want to struggle to understand, but they want to think about it in a new way. So where does the impulse to think about things in a new way come from? I think that one of the great powers of movements is that they can project another way of being to people, that some other thing is possible. I think this is certainly part of the great power of both Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., especially given the way their ideas were converging later in life. You could go back at any one point in time and find that there are people working on this or that will become important to history from below, but the key thing is what social force drives it into becoming something much bigger. And that, I think, that has to come down to the movements of the 60s and 70s and the ways those have played out ever since. Thank you for the question.
Unfortunately, we have to end the program here. Marcus's books are available for purchase right outside of the auditorium, and he is happy to sign. So please take this last opportunity for you to chat with him before he leaves the island in just 2 days. But I think he rather likes it here, so I hope that we all hope that you will come back very soon. And please join me in thanking him for all that he's done throughout the semester. It has been truly exciting and humbling to have him with us this semester. Mahalo for coming, and I hope that we will see you again at future Inouye Chair events. Thank you and good evening.